Has everybody been getting Amethyst's character totally wrong? Listen, Steven Universe is a show that's always had a pretty extensive cast of characters with, in my opinion, some pretty good character development to boot. Since the show's release in 2013, people have gravitated towards the show, not only because of the interesting character designs, but the variety of character archetypes that the show boasts. And yes, people have talked about how well written or not so well written the show is, and people have dissected it to absolutely no end. But in my opinion, I feel like there's a character in the main cast that people are missing a huge portion of their development, and honestly, by doing so, they're selling themselves short of an incredible narrative that has been woven over multiple seasons of Steven Universe. And obviously, the character I'm talking about is Amethyst, as when many people talk about her, they're going to bring up the self-deprecation, the lack of self-love, and her issues with identity. But in doing so, they fail to mention one of the biggest drives that Amethyst has as a character, and honestly, it's because they may be skipping over one of the most important episodes to Amethyst. And yes, Amethyst has had episodes that focus on her struggles, but there is one in particular that honestly changed the entire course of her character, which is why it is so important that we talk about the episode that changed Amethyst forever. But before we do that, there are actually two episodes we need to talk about first, one of them being Tiger Millionaire and one of them being Giant Woman. Again, two episodes that aren't really talked about in terms of Amethyst's development, but they introduce so many important things, it would be crazy not to talk about them. So with that being said, let's get into it. The very beginning of the episode starts off with another argument between Amethyst and Pearl. Obviously, this is pretty much the norm between these two at this point in the story, in which Amethyst does something that probably is more so a mistake due to her own carelessness, but is immediately met with Pearl yelling and screaming at her because, of course, Amethyst's mistake has unfortunately impacted the rest of the crystal gems. But this scene is pretty important because when you're looking at it, Amethyst isn't really taking to heart anything that Pearl is saying. And what's even more interesting is that the only time in which we see that Amethyst clearly takes something to heart is when Garnet steps in and says that Amethyst was making too many mistakes. Now, I want you guys to remember this because this dynamic is going to be incredibly important for the rest of the series and specifically for Amethyst's character development. Pearl is overly aggressive when it comes to Amethyst. Any minor mistake will be met with yelling and screaming to the point where Amethyst doesn't really respect the takes that Pearl gives her and instead will just brush them off as something that Pearl is overreacting over. But with Garnet, it's clear that Amethyst truly respects her and does look up to her. And so when Garnet is saying that Amethyst is making a mistake and obviously Amethyst doesn't know how to rectify it, it's going to hit her a lot harder than when Pearl is yelling at her. And at the end of this argument, we see that Pearl thinks that she actually got through to Amethyst and that they did something good, but instead they kind of just gave her a complex. Pearl thinks that reprimanding Amethyst is going to make her a better crystal gem, and Garnet thinks this as well, which is why she never stepped in to stop Pearl. But because they're not providing any solutions, Amethyst just has a lot of pent-up stress and rage. But there's something else that Amethyst is feeling, and that word is weak, which is one of the reasons why she ends up taking up wrestling, because she wants to feel stronger. The weakness that Amethyst feels is one of the reasons why she goes into the ring, why she puts on this persona that she is this absolutely strong, buff wrestler. Why? Because she wants to feel like she is in control. Strength and control is going to be some of the most important things to Amethyst's character, so don't forget it. This episode is also one of the first that establishes that Steven and Amethyst have the exact same feelings to the expectations given to them by Pearl and Garnet. To use their words, both of them are feeling very stifled by the expectations laid upon them. Both of them feel like they are not good enough and that they have to improve at a rate that is honestly unreasonable. And this is one of the reasons why Amethyst and Steven's relationship is probably the closest out of all of the crystal gems, because Amethyst and Steven are basically the exact same character. And again, something that was established very early in the series is going to be incredibly important later on, so don't forget this either. The ending of the episode also shows that Garnet and Amethyst are just not on the same footing. They are two completely different characters that just do not understand each other. Obviously, Steven comes in while Garnet and Amethyst are fighting in order to try to get Garnet to understand Amethyst's point of view. Also, something to note is that Garnet is absolutely destroying Amethyst in terms of strength. This fight is not fair by any means. At the end of the episode, we see that Garnet and Pearl are convinced by Steven and do let him and Amethyst have their grand moment. But again, this episode set up three major things about Amethyst's character. The first one is that she's honestly overwhelmed by the expectations of Garnet and Pearl. The second thing is that she feels like she doesn't have control of her life because she is not strong enough in order to do so. And the third and most important thing is that Amethyst continuously tells herself that she does not care what other people have to say about her, but it is made very clear in this episode that she absolutely does. Continuing on, Season 1, Episode episode 12, Giant Woman, is also an incredibly important episode because this is the one that introduces what fusion is. Specifically in this episode, we get to see the fusion between Pearl and Amethyst, which of course is Opal. This episode is able to reinforce a lot of what we saw in Tiger Millionaire. Specifically, we get to see how diametrically opposed Pearl and Amethyst are. The beginning of the episode suggests that Pearl and Amethyst used to be closer, and when we look at a couple episodes a little farther out, that does seem to be the case. When we're looking at the development of these two characters, it's pretty clear that Amethyst is in her teen phase, whereas Pearl is more in her young adult phase. Amethyst wants to become her own person, but Pearl wants Amethyst to basically act exactly like she does, which of course is going to cause a lot of strife between the two characters. The episode is centered around the dynamic between Pearl and Amethyst. It shows how similar and different these two characters truly are. Obviously, Steven wants them to form Opal, and because of that, he needs them to be working together and be on the same page, but we see throughout the entire episode that that is almost impossible. Carrying over from Tiger Millionaire, we not only see that Pearl is continuing to yell at Amethyst anytime she deems something as inappropriate, but also we see that Steven and Amethyst's friendship has grown. They have very similar personalities, and honestly, they are much closer than Pearl and Steven are. And I don't know if I'm the only one who noticed this while watching this episode, but when Steven is trying to get Pearl and Amethyst to make up, it seems like Pearl is the one who is pushing away first, which causes Amethyst to have the same reaction. Pearl is trying to get Amethyst to be too much like her and not enough like herself, which causes her to continuously lash out, and we see that Amethyst gets very defensive when Pearl does this. Although Pearl is right in certain circumstances that Amethyst is a bit too careless, Amethyst has always been very free-spirited and a bit chaotic, but at every turn, regardless if she does something right or wrong, she is told that what she is doing is bad. At this point in the story, the only thing that is really connecting these two characters is Steven and making sure that he is safe, and it's the only reason that they do end up working together at the end of the episode in order to create Opal. And even at the end of the episode, the person who is blamed for forgetting the Heaven Beetle is Amethyst. Pearl gets out of the fusion right away and begins to yell and scream at her. Both Pearl and Amethyst want to look good in Garnet's eyes, and because of that, Pearl ends up blaming Amethyst for a lot of things that are honestly both of their faults. So when we take into account Tiger Millionaire and Giant Woman, there are things that are made very clear about Amethyst's character going into one of her most important character building episodes. But if we need to take away a single point from both of these episodes, it would be this: every mistake that happens, everything that doesn't go as planned, is somehow always Amethyst's fault. And so, with those two episodes out of the way and the groundwork for Amethyst's character truly set, let us finally talk about the episode that changed Amethyst forever. And that, of course, is Season 1, Episode 20, Coach Steven. And yes, I know how weird it sounds that this is the episode that changes Amethyst's character for the worse, especially because it doesn't really have Amethyst as a main focal point. And don't worry, I know that. The episode mainly focuses on Pearl, but specifically, it focuses on her own definition of strength and how she is strong in the real way. The big theme of the episode is that yes, although Pearl isn't as physically strong as some of her opponents, she is able to use the strengths that she has in order to overcome them. Regardless of the obstacles that Pearl may face, she will always find a way to overcome them because she is going to be strong in the way that she knows how, not necessarily in physical strength. On the surface, an absolute great moral to learn, but when we're looking a little bit deeper at this episode, isn't it just so poetic that Pearl is able to show Steven this at the expense of Amethyst? Yeah, this is where the episodes Giant Woman and Tiger Millionaire really are going to come into play, because we already know that Amethyst was having trouble with her own ideals of strength. And as we start going through the episode, I think that you guys are going to realize that although this episode mainly focuses on Pearl, the ramifications on Amethyst are absolutely massive. The episode starts off with some immediate tension between Amethyst and Pearl, as Pearl ends up speaking over Amethyst to try to explain to Steven why they're at the spire. Again, we're building off of Pearl's character. She always wants to try to look smarter and cooler in the eyes of Steven and Garnet, and unfortunately, Amethyst will always be a casualty to Pearl's ego. Amethyst, of course, is able to brush this off, and when talking to Steven, becomes the better and stronger version of him. The entire episode is obviously talking about what strength truly is, but it is pretty clear that to Amethyst, physical strength is what it means to be strong. Pearl immediately bats down Amethyst's idea in order to knock down the spire with physical strength, but Garnet ends up saying that no, we actually need to be big and strong in order to take this obstacle head on, which of course leads to the scene where Amethyst and Garnet end up creating the fusion Sugilite. And of course, Pearl is immediately against this, saying that Garnet and Amethyst are too reckless as Sugilite, and because of of that, it could put people in danger. But we can look at her facial expressions and tell pretty clearly that the reason she doesn't want them to become Sugilite is because she wanted to fuse with Garnet instead. And this isn't conjecture because Pearl flat out says that she wants Garnet to fuse with her instead of with Amethyst. There's a pretty obvious competition between Amethyst and Pearl in order to have Garnet's approval, but in this case, it seems like Amethyst has finally won. For the first time in the series, Garnet is agreeing with Amethyst that yes, what we need here is physical strength, not some sort of well thought out plan. And yes, Pearl's jealousy is a big factor in this episode because it is pretty clear that yeah, she is absolutely jealous of Amethyst that she finally gets the spotlight. And in my opinion, it's a bit unwarranted for Pearl to be jealous considering that almost every other time in the series, Garnet agrees with her and her plan and usually reprimands Amethyst. This is one of the first time that Amethyst not only gets to finally show out, be cool to Steven, and be useful to Garnet. And I really hate to say this, but this may have been one of the only times in the series that Amethyst truly felt that she was enough. After always feeling like an afterthought, after always feeling like everything she does is wrong or a mistake, she finally gets to be the spotlight. And honestly, looking at it through this lens, it makes the ending of this episode even worse. And after the synchronization scene, in which again Pearl is trying to take away the spotlight from Amethyst, we get to meet Sugilite. And yes, Sugilite is the embodiment of physical strength. And we get to see how strong Sugilite is as she effortlessly takes down this tower. I also really appreciate the back and forth that Pearl and Sugilite have, where Pearl is saying that Sugilite is just too much, and yet Sugilite responds that maybe you're just too little, which honestly is probably more a dig at Amethyst herself rather than actually being an insult towards Pearl. Sugilite is a pretty reckless character who gets to do whatever she wants because of the physical strength that she has. And when we're really thinking about it, this is exactly what Amethyst wants to be. Amethyst has always wanted this, the power, the strength, the freedom to do whatever she wants, and finally she is able to silence the nagging voice of Pearl constantly berating her for every action that she takes. But unfortunately, the power goes to Amethyst's head and she ends up losing control. We have to remember that Garnet doesn't truly understand what's going on with Amethyst, and especially doesn't understand the weird power dynamic between Pearl and Amethyst. Garnet never thought that fusing with Amethyst was going to be such a big deal to Amethyst, nor would it be such a big deal to Pearl. Up until this point in the series, it's pretty clear that Garnet has always seen Pearl as the more reliable person, whereas Amethyst truly needs to grow up and become a better crystal gem. But when Garnet asks Amethyst to fuse, this was supposed to be the moment that Amethyst finally got the one-up on Pearl. Which is why it's so upsetting that Pearl in this episode gets to be strong in the real way. She gets to be the hero and Amethyst is shown to be the reckless villain. It just sucks that the one time that Garnet says Amethyst is right, that she is villainized in the episode. At the end of the episode, we get a fight between Sugilite and Pearl, and we can clearly see that Sugilite is on a power trip, saying that this is me and I am better than ever. And from this line, we can kind of make the assumption that yes, this is more so Amethyst speaking because she is getting everything that she wants at the moment. And during their fight, while Pearl is on the receiving end of a lot of Sugilite's attacks, we get to see Sugilite say the line, "You ain't nothing," which honestly could be taken as Amethyst venting her frustrations about Pearl. But as we know, Sugilite does end up being defeated by Pearl, and at the end, we actually do get to see how much Pearl truly cares about Garnet and Amethyst. I won't lie, it's a very touching moment between these three characters, but again, Pearl is shown to be right and Amethyst is shown to be wrong. And the moral for Amethyst is that regardless of what happens, regardless of how much she tries or how strong she is, it'll never be enough. Because unfortunately, Amethyst is weighed down by a tower of her own mistakes. And so, the trajectory for Amethyst's character is set. Somebody who is completely haunted by the mistakes that she made, and somebody who never quite feels that she is good enough. Many people don't realize the influence that Sugilite had over Amethyst, because after that episode, she is quite literally never the same. So let's continue on to Season 1, Episode 40, On the Run, which is an episode that is entirely focused on Amethyst and her mental state. The episode starts off with Amethyst feeling like she doesn't really have a home, and so her and Steven end up going to the place where she was created. On the way there, we get a pretty nice song number, and one thing that I really want to focus on is when Amethyst says that I don't care about what other people say, but I guess there are some things that will just never go away. A bit different than what she was saying back in Tiger Millionaire, when she was saying that you shouldn't allow people to make you feel bad. Many people probably didn't catch this, but this line is again harkening back to Coach Steven and what she did with Sugilite. By bottling up her frustrations and emotions and never trying to better herself, she ended up making a huge mistake. mistake, which of course made her look bad in the eyes of Garnet and made Pearl seem like the one who will always be right regardless of what Amethyst does. And that's the reason why she doesn't feel like she has a home in the temple, because everything she does is a mistake. And when you think about it, if everything you do is a mistake and you can never do anything right, at some point you are going to feel like you yourself are a mistake. And it's during this episode that the expectations that Pearl and Garnet have been placing upon her finally cause her to break down. During the episode, Amethyst takes Steven to the kindergarten, which is some place that he probably shouldn't have gone to. Pearl comes in and immediately she starts to yell at Amethyst, which causes both of them to fight. And during this fight, we get to see all of the pent-up frustration that Amethyst was carrying along with her. It's clear that Amethyst and Pearl were closer at some point, and unfortunately, distance came between them. And to Amethyst, it feels like Pearl just doesn't like her. Because Pearl is always right and is constantly trying to one-up her, it feels like Pearl just doesn't want her around. There's a line during their fight in which Pearl says that you can't beat me, and Amethyst just straight up says that I don't care. Because at this point, Amethyst is just fed up at feeling wrong and weak in comparison to Pearl. Of course, by the end of the episode, we get to see that Amethyst and Pearl do finally get to have the discussion that they so desperately needed. Amethyst starts off the conversation by telling Steven that she is bad and that nobody should go near her, again showing how she is completely deteriorated from the strong individual that we saw in the beginning of the series. And it gets so bad to the point where Amethyst straight up says that Pearl thinks she's just a big mistake. And it's at this point in the series in which Pearl realizes that she has been going about Amethyst the entire wrong way. Everything that she's doing has been to try to help Amethyst, but she realizes that at this point she's just making things worse, and it's one of the first times in which we see Pearl apologizes. And honestly, it is a really great apology, because Pearl has never saw Amethyst as somebody who cared about what people were saying to her, which is one of the reasons why Pearl was so hard on her, because she didn't think that she was able to get through to her because she didn't think Amethyst cared. And usually Pearl would be right. Amethyst is somebody who tries not to take things to heart, but after the events of Coach Steven and after making the big mistake with Sugilite, she's kind of just worn down. And so Pearl apologizing and telling Amethyst that no, she is not a mistake is huge for her character. One of the big things with character development is that one event isn't going to fix all of your problems, and this episode isn't going to make Amethyst magically better. But one of the big things that came out of this episode is Amethyst finally allowing her emotions to come to the surface. This is one of the first times that Amethyst is not only able to express her emotions, but she's able to be a bit retrospective about them. And this is going to be something pretty important for the next episode that we're going to discuss. The next episode that we need to talk about is Season 2, Episode 5, Reformed. The episode starts off with Steven and Amethyst taking a quiz on which crying breakfast friend Amethyst is. Obviously, these questions are precursors to what's going to happen in the episode, but I really like how Amethyst is pretty stumped on how she is supposed to answer if she cares about how other people perceive her. Again, pretty different from Amethyst in the beginning of the series, who stated that she doesn't care about how others see her. But it's pretty clear in this episode that yes, Amethyst does care, and specifically, Amethyst cares a lot when it comes to Garnet. And fortunately for us, this episode focuses on the relationship between Amethyst and Garnet, and how Amethyst is trying to look stronger in the eyes of Garnet. Throughout the episode, we see that Amethyst is acting pretty nonchalant, but in my opinion, she's acting out because she wants to get Garnet's attention. There's a scene in the beginning of the episode in which Amethyst questions Garnet as to why she didn't just ask her to capture the monster, and Garnet just says, "'Cause you wouldn't do it." And after that, Amethyst is continuing to act out and being very preoccupied on how Garnet is destroying her stuff and not really caring about it. The most important thing to Garnet right now is capturing this gem monster because it could be a danger to her and her allies. But it's clear that Amethyst wants Garnet's attention more focused on her rather than on the mission. Yes, it is a bit childish, but after what happened with Sugilite, their relationship really was never the same. And in my opinion, she is constantly trying to get Garnet's approval because she wants to atone for the mistake that she made. During the episode, Amethyst does end up getting poofed and reforms relatively quickly, to the dismay of Garnet because Amethyst wasn't taking her reformation seriously. And Garnet makes this very well known by talking to Steven and even comparing Amethyst's reformation to Pearl's. And as we've already established, we should not be comparing Amethyst to Pearl because she is going to take that very seriously. And she does, and she has an emotional outburst because she is so tired of being compared to Pearl in every way. Amethyst is upset that Garnet is angry with her about her reformation. She's upset that there's a monster in her room that Garnet has to go through and try to capture, and she's upset at the fact that she herself didn't take more time for her reformation. Amethyst ends up getting re-poofed and comes back again, this time looking like Pearl. And obviously, instead of praising her, Garnet is pretty upset. On the surface, it looks like Amethyst is trying to make Garnet mad, but underneath it, Amethyst is just trying to make Garnet happy and get her approval. But that clearly didn't happen, as Garnet is even more upset at Amethyst at this point. And who would have expected it, but they get into a verbal confrontation in which Garnet says that Amethyst is putting the team at risk. And Amethyst takes this as an attack on how strong she is, again harkening back to how Amethyst's entire character is built around her strength. Amethyst only came back as Pearl because Garnet said that she should be more like Pearl. That's it. Point blank. But now Garnet is saying that Amethyst isn't strong enough, and so when Amethyst has to eventually reform after getting poofed again, she comes back as a stronger version of herself. But again, the form that she comes back as isn't going to get Garnet's approval, and so she ends up acting out and trying to chase after the monster herself. Eventually, we get to the point where Amethyst is just asking Garnet what she wants of her because she just doesn't understand how to be the person that Garnet wants her to be. And it's at this point that Steven ends up saying that Amethyst cannot think about herself because she doesn't want to go through and process her own emotions, in which Amethyst gets repoofed and ends up staying like that until she's truly able to figure out what she wants to come back as. As we're waiting for Amethyst to come back, Garnet does say that she was too hard on her. Again, the expectations that they're placing on Amethyst can sometimes be overwhelming. But at the end of the episode, Amethyst reforms and Garnet gives her approval, saying that this is the perfect form for her. Amethyst retorts that this is just something that feels right, and Garnet says that's why it's perfect. And the episode ends off with everybody trying to reaffirm Amethyst that she is enough and that she is perfect just the way she is. She doesn't have to be anything else in order to be loved by the gems, and that's something that I think is very important. Not to bring in anime terms, but it's pretty clear that Amethyst is a tsundere. She's somebody that wants to express her emotions, but just can't. This episode is important for two major reasons. The first reason is that yes, finally, Amethyst has started to go through her emotions and is able to dissect why she is feeling the way that she is. And the second thing is that both Garnet and Pearl have both shown their approval for Amethyst, saying that she herself is perfect the way that she is. But we still see that Amethyst is struggling with the fact that she feels weak, and it's something that's going to be a sore spot for a very long time in the series. And the second thing that this episode shows us is that Amethyst has a very difficult time owning up to her mistakes and trying to process how to fix them. And of course, these two things are going to be very important as we move on to the next episode. And it just so happens that the next episode that we are going to talk about is a perfect conclusion to everything that happened in Coach Steven. So yes, it's time to talk about Season 2, Episode 11, Cry for Help. And this episode directly talks about the events that happened within Coach Steven and is basically the ending to this saga of Amethyst's character development. And getting a bit more specific, this episode mainly focuses on the fact that Amethyst doesn't know how to atone for her mistakes. At this point in the series, Amethyst has a pretty bad self-image of herself, and this is caused by two factors. The first factor being is that every time she makes a mistake, she doesn't know how to solve it and instead ends up making it a bit worse. The second thing is that she doesn't understand her role within the Crystal Gem. She feels as though she should be the strong enforcer, but doesn't have the physical strength to back it up. And because of this, Amethyst feels weak and is constantly trying to gain approval from Garnet. And these two things are going to beautifully tie into the episode, so let's get into it. The episode begins with Steven and Amethyst watching Crying Breakfast Friends, which is obviously supposed to be an allegory for Steven Universe. And in fact, I always thought it was pretty funny that this cartoon within a cartoon was just spoiling what's going to happen throughout the entire episode, basically showing that if people just talk through their emotions instead of just pointing at a problem and crying, that things would actually get better. But I digress. As Steven and Amethyst are watching the cartoon, it ends up getting interrupted by Peridot, who is trying to get a message out to Homeworld. And it just so happens that the way Peridot is doing this is by using the old communication hub that Sugilite supposedly destroyed. Once they make their way to the tower, Steven brings up that they should form Sugilite again in order to destroy it. And obviously, Amethyst is completely for this because this would be a perfect way to atone for the mistake before in which she went out of control. Ever since Sugilite was formed back in Season 1, Amethyst has been maturing. And listen, it's not like she's gotten over any of her trauma, but at this point in the story, she's at least expressing her emotions a lot better. I wouldn't necessarily say that Amethyst is less reckless, but I will say that she's being a bit more thoughtful in the actions that she does. It's pretty clear that Amethyst wants to be a better person, and she wants to be the gem that both Garnet and Pearl know that she can be. But unfortunately, Amethyst is still now struggling with her own self-image, which is why it hits her so hard that Garnet says that they will not be using Sugilite. Although Garnet has a pretty good explanation for this, and honestly, it is completely warranted that Sugilite should be benched, what this means for Amethyst is that her mistakes will continuously be brought up, and that of course she will never be able to truly fix what she broke in the past, and that is something that is is going to haunt her, as we will see throughout this episode. Obviously, in this episode, Garnet decides to fuse with Pearl, and they create Sardonyx. Obviously, this is going to upset Amethyst, but I do want you to notice that when Pearl and Garnet are fusing, Amethyst doesn't try to take the spotlight away from them. Unlike Pearl, who is trying to keep Steven's attention away from Amethyst and Garnet, Amethyst is obviously upset, but she allows them to have the spotlight. She allows them to do their own thing, and that's something that's very important. And Amethyst from Steven 1 would probably try to do something to ruin their fusion dance or to take Steven's attention away, but she doesn't, and this shows a lot of character growth from her. And we honestly see how mature Amethyst handles this, especially when Sardonyx takes an obvious jab at her. Instead of blowing up and getting really angry or having a reaction, all we see is a bit of a frown and just allowing it to pass over her. A very small scene, but this of course is the first step into accepting that she made a mistake and honestly is being rightfully criticized for that mistake. Sardonyx is able to effortlessly take down the tower, which obviously is in stark contrast to what happened with Sugilite, and we see afterwards that everyone is happy, giggling, and Garnet obviously shows her signs of approval to Pearl, and the only person who's left out is Amethyst. And the one person that she always seems to have that connection with, Steven, has his attention focused on Garnet and Pearl, which of course is going to make her feel even more isolated and is going to make the mistakes she made in the past feel even more intense. And throughout the episode, we get to see how much this actually has impacted Amethyst. It's why I really appreciate the scene where Amethyst is just sulking around the house. She's not trying to make a scene, she's not trying to feel noticed, all she's trying to do is to not make her mistake even worse. This is the lesson that she learned a few episodes back in the episode Reformed, in which acting out and trying to get other people's attention isn't going to make things better, it's just going to make things worse. After this scene, we find that Peridot has reactivated the tower, and so Garnet and Pearl end up forming Sardonyx again, and of course are leaving Amethyst out of the entire thing. And this of course is where we get Amethyst's song number, Tower of Mistakes. And this song encapsulates perfectly how Amethyst is feeling about the entire situation. In the beginning of the song, when she says, "I think you're better off with her, I think that she's better for you," this is actually her saying that Pearl is the perfect crystal gem. Obviously, Pearl and Amethyst have always been fighting for Garnet, and it seems as though Amethyst is now saying that Pearl is won. Amethyst sees Pearl as somebody who is perfect, who is able to get the job done in a way that Garnet approves of, and also isn't allowing her emotions to dictate what is happening, unlike of course herself, who needed to use Garnet in order to feel stronger because she herself feels weak. But at this point in the story, she doesn't really care about how weak she feels. All she wants to do is make it up to Garnet so that she sees her in a positive light again. And we've talked about in multiple episodes how Amethyst is trying to get Garnet's approval and yet never seems to be able to. Even in the previous episode that we talked about, in which Garnet said that her new form is perfect, still her actions have never got that sign of approval from Garnet. But as Amethyst states in this song, she doesn't know how to do it. She doesn't know how to fix her mistakes, and because of that, they continue to build up and weigh her down. And eventually, everything comes crashing down, and she is just left with the rubble of what she has done. I love this song number. Not only does it give us a lot of insight into Amethyst's emotional state, but it also shows her maturity. Amethyst, for the first time, is actually talking about her emotions out loud to Steven in order to get him to understand how she's feeling. All the way back to Tiger Millionaire, Amethyst has been somebody who has tried to keep her emotions locked up in order to keep this persona. But throughout these episodes, we have seen her not only slowly break down this emotional wall, but also feel more comfortable in letting other people in. This song number is the culmination of Amethyst's hard work coming to fruition, because finally she is able to open up and understand why she is feeling so bad. The last little bit I'll say about this song is that although Amethyst does still feel weak and it's still a major sore spot for her, she's going to push those emotions down deeper because the main thing that she is concerned about is Garnet's approval. And so after confiding in Steven, he actually comes up with a pretty good plan in order to get Amethyst to look like the hero in the eyes of Garnet. Both Steven and Amethyst end up going back to the tower in order to do a stakeout to find Peridot. And they do end up finding who's been putting back together the tower, but it's not Peridot, it's Pearl. And very quickly, Amethyst realizes that Pearl is doing the exact same thing that Amethyst was doing. Pearl was using Garnet in order to feel stronger, something that Amethyst admitted to earlier in the episode that she was doing as well. When they formed Sugilite, she was using Garnet in order to feel strong, which is why they ended up losing control. And this mistake has been haunting Amethyst ever since she did it, which is why when they go back to the tower, Amethyst has to say something. But in this scene, when Amethyst is calling out Pearl, she isn't doing it to try to get her in trouble, she is doing it for Pearl's well-being. Amethyst isn't trying to look good in the eyes of Garnet at this moment, she is trying to stop Pearl from making a huge huge mistake. But Amethyst in this moment already knows that Pearl made the mistake, and honestly, telling is going to make it worse, which is why she actually stops, and Steven is the one who has to call Pearl out. Amethyst realizes that if she tells Garnet what Pearl is doing, it is going to create a massive rift between the two characters. And even though technically it would mean that Amethyst now has the one-up on Pearl, she doesn't want to do it. And even when Garnet finds out and begins yelling at Pearl, Amethyst comes to her defense. It's at this moment that Amethyst realizes that her and Pearl have a lot more in common than she originally thought. Even though Amethyst during this episode has been at her absolute lowest, even though Garnet told her that she is too unstable to fuse, and even though Sardonyx did take shots at Amethyst for her recklessness, she's still trying to help Pearl. She understands what happens when you make a mistake this large and is trying to help Pearl in any way possible because she doesn't want her to feel the way that she does. But in the end, it's too late, and Amethyst and Garnet do end up forming Sugilite and end up destroying the Tower of Amethyst's mistake. This episode is pretty full circle. In Coach Steven, we see that Pearl is the one who is deemed as the hero and as somebody who is strong but in her own way. Cry for Help shows that Amethyst understands her mistakes and is constantly trying to grow as a person and mature along with that. Amethyst's personality hasn't changed. She's still a go-with-the-flow type of character and somebody who likes to have fun, but she's a lot more emotionally mature at this point. Amethyst realizes that it's okay to talk about her emotions, and it's okay to talk about them with Steven, who is one of the only people who truly understand what she's going through. Again, this episode gives us a bit of closure for the Sugilite saga of Amethyst's character development. Throughout these episodes, Amethyst has become more mature, she has become more in control of herself, and she has come to realize that she has a bit more responsibility in the actions that she takes. Although it's kind of weird to say, Amethyst realizes that although she did make mistakes, it could have been a lot worse. But although this episode does give Amethyst closure to what her and Garnet had done back in season 1, there's still something that hasn't been addressed. Yeah, although Amethyst has basically fixed her relationship with Garnet, there is still one thing that is going to eat away at her for the rest of the series, and that of course is the fact that Amethyst is weak. Weakness will always be a major part of Amethyst's character. In fact, it's one of her major drives throughout the entire series. Amethyst has been a character who always wants to be strong, and in some points of the series, she has had this strength and she's been able to use it, like when she formed Sugilite. But the issue is, she isn't Sugilite all of the time, she's Amethyst all of the time, and that is the big point of contention, which is why going forward, when we're talking about Amethyst's character development, it is going to be her coming to terms with the fact that she isn't going to be as strong as many of her enemies, which of course would bring us to season 3, episode 18, Crack the Whip. And the reason I want to skip all the way to Crack the Whip is because in my opinion, this is the episode in which Amethyst truly realizes that she will never have the strength that she desires. The episode starts off with Steven, Amethyst, and Connie all hanging out. There's a pretty interesting dialogue between her and Connie in which Amethyst states that she doesn't really have to train every single detail. Some things will just come to you in the heat of battle. And when it eventually comes time in the episode for Amethyst to take down a gem monster, she's able to do it by herself. But that isn't the only enemy that they run into, as Jasper eventually faces off against Amethyst, and Amethyst loses bad. I think it's made pretty clear in the episode that Amethyst would have put up a much better fight if she wasn't having the mental strain of feeling weak, especially in regards to Jasper. But in the end, Amethyst ends up getting pooped by Jasper, and Steven and Connie have to fuse in order to take her out. Amethyst eventually reforms, but realizes that she lost and Steven and Connie won. And Amethyst is pretty upset, not at Steven and Connie for beating Jasper, but at herself because of how weak she is. Ever since she had a taste of the power that Garnet possesses, she has wanted to be that strong. And during Cry for Help, she ends up repressing those feelings in order to make it up to Garnet, but those feelings are resurfacing. The big issue with Amethyst is that she feels as though she needs to do everything alone, and that's going to be very important in the next coming episodes. Amethyst doesn't want to be a burden to other people. She wants to be able to protect her friends, and she wants to be somebody that Steven can look up to. But if Amethyst is too weak, then that's never going to happen, which leads into season 3, episode 19, Steven versus Amethyst. As Steven does end up picking up on the fact that Amethyst is pretty depressed after fighting Jasper and invites her to training. But during this training session, Amethyst realizes that Steven has completely overtaken her. It also doesn't help that Pearl is constantly telling Amethyst that she should not be taking it easy on Steven, even though she's giving it her all. Obviously, this makes Amethyst even more depressed, and so Steven, trying to cheer her up, tries to let her win in a video game, which ends up blowing back up in his face. Steven and Amethyst end up getting into a bit of a fight in which Amethyst is obviously feeling completely useless. And during this conversation, Amethyst says some things that is pretty insulting to Steven, saying that he used to be the worst crystal gem, but now it's her. But what she's actually trying to say in this conversation is that Steven has gotten so much stronger than her, and yet she is basically plateaued. And it makes her feel pretty bad because Steven has not been at it as long as she has, and yet he's already overtaken her and he's already stronger. Meaning that there's a chance that Amethyst will never get stronger and that she will always stay at this level of strength, which to her is just being plain weak. And that's why Amethyst gets so upset seeing Steven's growth, because regardless of what she does, it doesn't seem like she gets stronger, and yet somebody who started way after her is already overtaken her. And of course, this is going to make her feel even more useless and even more of an outsider. Towards the end of the episode, Steven and Amethyst do end up having a mock battle in which we realize that both of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. One could even say that they are both strong in their own way. Or perhaps you could rephrase this as being strong in the real way. See what I did there? Strong in the real way? I keep trying to tell y'all that Coach Steven is one of the most important episodes for Amethyst because basically the lesson that Steven and Pearl learn in this episode is the same one that Amethyst is learning throughout the entire series. But of course, all great character arcs must eventually come to an end. And for Amethyst, that end is Season 3, Episodes 22 and 23, Beta and Earthlings. The episodes have a continuous story, so it's better to just combine them and talk about them this way. The episode starts off with Steven and Amethyst having a day off, as Amethyst has been training relentlessly in order to try to take on Jasper. Amethyst has been obsessing over Jasper, trying to do everything in her power in order to get stronger. But of course, Steven realizes that this mentality is not healthy, so he tries to get Amethyst's mind off of Jasper by visiting Lapis and Peridot. But of course, this doesn't end up working, and Amethyst runs off in order to train more. Peridot ends up talking to Amethyst and Steven, revealing that Jasper and Amethyst were both created on Earth, and this eventually leads to all three of them going to visit the Beta Kindergarten, the kindergarten that Jasper was created in. As they're walking around the kindergarten, Peridot is going over all of the issues that it has, showing how Amethyst Kindergarten is superior. Until of course they end up finding the exit hole that Jasper came out of, in which it is completely perfect. Now, I didn't go over this before, but there is an episode that talks about how Amethyst is defective and how she was overcooked, which is one of the reasons why she's so small. And when we contrast this to the fact that Jasper's hole is basically perfect in every way, it shows the massive difference between these two characters. Amethyst has always looked up to the stronger gems in Steven Universe, whether it be Rose Quartz or Garnet. Both of these gems are obviously physically stronger than Amethyst is. To Amethyst, her self-worth is based entirely on how strong she is, and so when she runs into Jasper, who is everything that she technically was supposed to be, she is incredibly jealous. And to prove that she has a right to not only exist, but to be a part of the Crystal Gems, she needs to beat Jasper, because this will then prove to herself that yes, she is strong. This episode makes it very clear that to Amethyst, physical strength is tied to self-worth. When you're looking at it from the outside, it's pretty interesting how Amethyst seems to focus on two strong characters, one of them being Garnet and one of them being Jasper. Jasper and Garnet obviously have two completely different mentalities, but they do share something in common, and that of course is the fact that they're physically strong. But when you're looking at these two characters, it's pretty clear that although Garnet is very strong, physical strength does not define her. It's her attitude, it's her leadership skills, it's the way that she's able to develop and help others around her grow. With Jasper though, the only thing that she truly has is her devotion to the diamonds and her physical strength. That's pretty much it. She has nobody else to rely on, whereas Garnet always has somebody to rely on within herself. And that's the key thing that Amethyst has always been missing, that although these two characters are both strong, one of them is always relying on other people, where the other one is forever alone. Some people are stronger than others, that much is true, but by relying on others, that's where you can reveal your true strength. And after a quick fight with Jasper, in which again, Amethyst is outmatched and outclassed, she ends up having a conversation with Steven in which he basically is saying that he understands exactly what she is going through. He understands not fitting in and feeling like he doesn't belong, and he understands how hard it is to be weak. But true strength doesn't come with isolation, and it's something that Amethyst in this episode finally realizes. It's something that she honestly realized all the way back in Coach Steven when she formed Sugilite and gained that physical strength. Just because because you have physical strength does not mean that you are strong. It is the way that you use your strengths and weaknesses that make you a stronger gem. And finally, at this moment, Amethyst understands. And so when Steven and Amethyst finally fuse into smoky quartz, this is one of the most perfect fusions that Amethyst has been a part of. These are two people who have been weak and are constantly striving to be better. They understand each other, and because they understand each other so well, they are able to use all of their skills to their absolute potential. Just like when Stevani was able to defeat Jasper a couple episodes back, finally, Smoky Quartz is going to be able to defeat Jasper in the exact same way. And finally, after defeating Jasper, Amethyst learns that there is more to strength than being strong. Yes, she has learned to be strong in the real way. And the ending of this episode is incredibly poetic because Amethyst won the battle and is surrounded by people who love and care for her. Whereas Jasper, although she is stronger than the people around her, is alone, is isolated, and is a loser. There's also a pretty neat comparison that you can make to Jasper getting corrupted and Sugalite going crazy. Both Amethyst and Jasper went on a power trip after fusing because they finally had the physical strength that they desired. But in both characters' cases, this was a mistake and one that will be very costly for both. And at the end of the episode, we see how heartbroken Amethyst is to see somebody go down the same path that she went on. Just like she wanted to help Pearl when she manipulated Guarded into fusing with her, she wants to help Jasper understand what it means to have true strength. And at the end of the episode, we finally get to see a relaxed Amethyst who has gone through a huge emotional journey. To end this off, I think we can see that Amethyst is a pretty complex character. She has a development cycle that isn't linear. She bounces back and forth from acceptance to self-deprecation to understanding, and it's something that's truly unique to her character. When people talk about Amethyst, they like to simplify her to just a character that doesn't like herself, and honestly, it's pretty relatable to a lot of people to just dislike qualities that you have. But I also do think it's important to look at the reasons why Amethyst dislikes herself, mainly the fact that she feels as though she is too weak and the body dysmorphia that comes along with her size. Within the show, I think it's pretty clear that Amethyst realizes that sometimes being powerful doesn't necessarily mean that you are a strong person, and vice versa. Just as Pearl realized that she could be strong with the encouragement of others, as well as understanding that strength can come at a cost, Amethyst realizes that she can be strong in her own way by accepting her faults and accepting the help of others. Understanding your own weakness and limitations is important in order to grow as a person, and it's something that Amethyst does very well throughout the entirety of the show. Sometimes there's just things about ourselves that we just cannot change, but that isn't stopping us from becoming the best version of ourselves. And in essence, that's what truly makes Amethyst such a fantastic character, because Amethyst was able to get a glimpse of what true power was, understood the consequences of that, and finally found an inner strength that was inside of her the entire time. That's right, Amethyst became strong in the real way. But of course, that's all I have for you today, so if you enjoyed this video and want more, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe. It really does help out the channel a lot, and let me know down in the comments below what character you want to see next. But that's it, so until next time, Tanuki Crew, peace.